The frost had come in the night, not heavy enough to damage anything, just enough to leave the grass stiff and the stone paths pale with it. Miriam pulled her coat tighter across her chest and carried the empty buckets through the side gate of Ashford Park, the way she always did on gala mornings, before the caterers arrived, and the committee began assembling itself in the front rooms with clipboards and opinions. She liked the estate at this hour. She liked the way the light sat low across the formal gardens and turned everything a particular shade of amber that no arrangement she ever made could quite capture. She had been coming through this gate since she was 9 years old, holding her mother's hand, watching her mother's face change the moment they crossed onto the grounds. The rose beds were in the northeast corner of the walled garden, sheltered from the main paths by a low yew hedge that her mother had grown from cuttings. Miriam set her buckets down near the stone bench and pulled on her work gloves. She had 3 hours before Gerald arrived to approve the arrangement, and she intended to use every minute of them. The gala was a significant occasion, the estate's autumn fundraiser for the Regional Land Trust, and Gerald had told her twice already that the flowers needed to make an impression. He had said this as though the quality of her work was perpetually in question, which was, she had learned, simply how Gerald spoke to her. She was reaching for her pruning shears when she saw the man. He was kneeling near the far end of the rose beds, in the narrow strip between the last planted row and the old stone wall. He wore a canvas jacket, the kind sold in hardware shops, gone soft at the elbows. His trousers were dark with damp from the knees down. He was very still, both hands resting on his thighs, looking at the canes of a rose she recognized as the old climber, the one that had grown against the south wall for as long as she could remember, whose proper name she had never known. Miriam stood for a moment and watched him. He did not look like a trespasser. He looked like someone who had arrived before her with the same quiet intention. She picked up her water bottle from the top of the bucket stack, walked across the bed path, and stopped a few feet away. "Good morning," she said. "Can I get you something? I have water if you want it." He looked up. He was older than she had first guessed, somewhere in his 70s, with a deeply lined face and eyes that were a particular shade of grey-green she associated with overcast winter sky. He looked at the water bottle and then at her. "Thank you," he said. He took it from her without ceremony and drank, then handed it back. "Early for this kind of work." "Gala tonight," she said. "I need the light for the cutting." He nodded as if this were entirely reasonable and looked back at the climber. "Madame Alfred Carrière," he said. "That one. She's been here since before the second fence was put in. Blooms late into the year if you don't cut her back too hard in summer." Miriam looked at the old climber and then back at him. I knew she had a name. I never knew what it was. Most people don't ask. He rose, slowly, one hand on his knee. He was taller standing than she had expected. "That one along the centre path is Tuscany Superb, Old Gallica. The beds your side of the bench are mostly David Austin varieties, the ones with the copper in the outer petals. Those are Roald Dahl. The ones with the deeper bowl are Olivia Rose." He looked at her. "You're cutting for the gala." "The main arrangement, yes. Foyer table and 4 side tables in the east wing." He walked slowly along the row, glancing at each plant with an ease that suggested he was not reading them, but remembering them. He paused at a smaller shrub near the corner post, one that Miriam herself had always passed over, its growth less showy than its neighbours. "This one," he said. "Complicata. She looks modest. But if you add 2 or 3 stems to a white arrangement, you'll see what she does." Miriam looked at the shrub. Its canes were bare now, as everything was bare in November, but she could see the form of it, the way it held its branches in loose, generous arcs. "I'll try it," she said. He didn't respond to that. He just moved on along the wall, one hand occasionally dropping to touch a cane or turn a label tag. He seemed wholly absorbed and not at all troubled by her presence, and she found that she did not mind his presence either. She went back to her own end of the beds and began selecting, clipping, laying the cut stems carefully across the open bucket. The light was improving. Behind the yew hedge, a blackbird had started its morning working through of the garden's quieter corners. They worked in a companionable silence for the better part of an hour. She asked him, at one point, how he knew the Gallica from the Austin varieties by cane alone, with no leaf and no flower to guide him. He said he had been looking at these particular plants for a long time. She didn't press him on that. It seemed like a complete answer. When she had enough for the arrangement, she gathered her buckets and pulled off her gloves. He was sitting on the stone bench by then, not doing anything, simply looking at the beds with his hands quiet in his lap. "Thank you," she said, "for the complicata tip." He looked over. "Your mother knew that one," he said. "She was the one who planted it there." Miriam went still. "You knew my mother." "Edna Voss," he said. "Yes. She was head gardener here for 22 years. Very good at knowing what a plant wanted before the plant knew itself." Miriam looked at the small shrub in the corner. Her throat felt odd. "She never talked much about the specific roses," she said. "To me. She talked about the soil." "The soil was her religion," he said. "The roses were her affection." She carried the buckets back to the workroom, and twice on the way she stopped and turned around, not to go back, but just because the weight of what he had said was following her at a short distance. The workroom was a long, low-ceilinged space attached to the east wing, with a stone floor and wooden benches down both sides. Pauline was already there when Miriam arrived, sorting wire and tape at the far end. "You look like someone told you the frost got the dahlias," Pauline said. "There's a man in the rose garden," Miriam said. "He knew my mother." Pauline looked up. "Knew her from when?" "From when she worked here. He knew all the roses by name. He knew which ones she planted." "Old man. Wears that canvas jacket like it's the only coat he owns?" Miriam set the buckets down. "You've seen him before." "Twice," Pauline said. "In the autumn, the last 2 years. He walks the grounds in the mornings. I thought he was one of Gerald's contractors. I didn't ask." Miriam thought about asking Gerald who the man was, and then thought about what that conversation would actually look like, and decided to work instead. She began conditioning the stems, cutting the ends at an angle, stripping the lower leaves, sorting by variety into the deep water buckets. The complicata she put in a separate bucket and looked at for a moment. The bare canes were not much to look at. She trusted the old man's knowledge of them anyway. The arrangement was for the foyer table first, the centerpiece, the one that would be seen before anything else. She had planned it as an ascending structure in warm whites and creams, with the deeper copper of the Roald Dahl roses as a grounding note at the lower rim, and the tall, pale stems of the Madame Alfred Carrière climbing through the upper section. She had spent the previous evening sketching the proportions on a notepad, the way her mother had taught her, not because she needed the sketch to work, but because sketching forced her to think through each decision before she touched the flowers. She was halfway through the foyer arrangement when Gerald came in. He came in without knocking, which he always did, and he brought 3 members of the gala committee with him, which he occasionally did when he wanted an audience for something. There was a man Miriam didn't know, a woman in a camel-coloured coat who served on the Land Trust Board, and a young man named Owen, who worked in Gerald's office and who had, over the past 2 years, quietly been given credit for various things Miriam had done. Gerald looked at the arrangement on the bench. He looked at it the way a person looks at a document they are preparing to find fault with. "It's very busy," he said. Miriam kept her hands moving. "It's in process," she said. "The upper section isn't placed yet." The committee has been discussing something a bit more restrained for the foyer. Less cottage, more estate. He said the word estate with a particular weight, as if the word itself were doing useful work. Owen had some thoughts about structure. Owen, you want to talk through the concept? Owen, who was 24 and had studied event management at a college in the north, stepped forward and described an arrangement of white Phalaenopsis orchids and mercury glass stems that he had apparently been sourcing from a florist in the city. He described it with the confidence of someone who had been told in advance that the room would agree with him. The woman in the camel coat looked at Miriam's arrangement and then at Gerald. What's currently being built here? An earlier concept, Gerald said. We've moved on. Miriam looked up from the bench. The estate roses are in season, she said. They're from the walled garden, the Madame Alfred Carrière on the south wall, the Tuscany Superbe along the centre path. The flowers are from this property. The committee's preference is for something with a more polished finish, Gerald said, addressing the woman in the camel coat rather than Miriam. The woman in the camel coat said nothing. She was looking at the complicata stems in their separate bucket with an expression Miriam couldn't read. After they left, Pauline came to stand beside her at the bench. They were both quiet for a moment, listening to the sound of Gerald's group moving down the corridor towards the main house. He's going to put Owen's name on the event brief, Pauline said. He already has, Miriam said. She reached for the complicata stems. Pauline watched her work. You're not going to say anything. I'm going to finish the arrangement, Miriam said. She said it quietly, without heat, and Pauline, who had known her for 4 years, recognized the particular quality of that quiet and didn't argue with it. The afternoon wore on. The caterers arrived at 12:30 and took over the kitchen corridor. 2 women from the events company Gerald had hired brought racks of chairs through the east wing and clattered them on the stone floor without apology. Owen appeared twice, both times on his phone, both times without acknowledging Miriam. The foyer table arrangement was finished by 2 o'clock. She moved on to the 4 side tables, using smaller versions of the same structure, each one anchored with a single complicata stem at the lower left, the way her mother had anchored arrangements with the single, unusual note that drew the eye inward. At 3:30, she needed to bring the last bucket from the cold store, and the cold store was accessed from the courtyard on the north side of the east wing. She went around through the covered passage rather than through the main house, and she was passing the half-open door of Gerald's office when she heard her name. She stopped because she heard it, not because she was listening. That was the simple truth of it. She stopped, and the voice continued, and she stood in the passage and heard what she had not been meant to hear. Gerald was on the phone. She knew his phone voice, its particular pitch of smooth confidence, the way he dropped into a lower register when he was speaking to someone he considered worth impressing. The arrangement is Miriam's work, technically, he was saying, but we're presenting it under the event concept Owen developed. Yes. No, she's been on staff for 8 years, and it's become one of those situations where you keep someone on out of sentiment. Her mother was head gardener here for a long time, and the previous management had a soft spot. I've been managing the situation carefully. She does the work, she doesn't make waves, but the face of it needs to be someone the committee can invest in. A pause. Then, Miriam is a liability in that sense, yes. Capable, but not someone you build a brand around, not at this level. Another pause. I'll handle it after the gala. I've been meaning to restructure the florals operation anyway. Miriam stood in the passage for a moment after his voice stopped carrying. The cold store door was 6 steps further. She took the 6 steps, opened the door, retrieved the bucket, and walked back the way she had come. She didn't tell Pauline what she had heard. She went back to the workroom and stood at the bench with her hands flat on the wood and looked at the last of the cut stems in the water. 8 years. She had been working these beds, conditioning these flowers, building arrangements for every event Gerald hosted for 8 years. She had been her mother's daughter in this place for longer than that, since childhood, since the first time Edna Voss had shown her how to look at a plant and see not what it was, but what it was trying to become. And Gerald had looked at all of that and seen a liability kept on out of sentiment. She thought about the old man in the rose garden that morning. She thought about the way he had said her mother's name, Edna Voss, not with sympathy, not with the slightly careful softness people used when they mentioned the dead, but with simple directness, as if her mother was simply a fact of this place, as present as the Madame Alfred Carrière on the south wall. She finished the last table arrangement. She took more care with it than any of the others. She placed the complicata stem at the lower left and stepped back and looked at it for a long moment. And then she carried it to its table in the east wing herself, because the events company staff had proven careless with the chairs, and she wasn't going to trust them with this. In the walled garden, between carrying the last arrangement and beginning to pack up the workroom, she walked back through the gate to check on the rose beds. She didn't know exactly why she went. The light was low, and the frost damp of the morning had given way to a dry cold that smelled of stone and leaf mould. The old man was not there. The garden was empty. She walked the length of the rose beds, looking at each plant the way he had looked at them that morning, and when she reached the complicata in the corner, she stopped and crouched down, pulling one glove off to touch the bark of the nearest cane. Her mother had planted this one. Her mother had known its name and its nature, had known what it would do in an arrangement, had chosen its position in the garden with the same quiet deliberation she brought to everything. And then her mother had gone, 12 years ago now, and the rose had simply continued being what it was, growing in its modest arcs in its corner, unannounced, its name unknown to anyone who passed it. She stood up and pulled her glove back on and walked to the gate. The gala opened at 7. Miriam was in the workroom at 6:30, pressing her good blouse, when Pauline appeared in the doorway. "He's here," Pauline said. "Gerald's been here all afternoon." "Not Gerald." Pauline came fully into the room and closed the door behind her. "Whoever that old man in the garden is, he came in through the front entrance about 20 minutes ago. He came in a car, Miriam. A car and a driver and someone walking next to him who looked like a solicitor." Miriam stopped pressing. "He came to the gala." "He walked through the front entrance and the front entrance staff all stood up," Pauline said. "I was at the end of the corridor. I saw it." There was a particular quality to the silence that followed. Miriam looked down at the iron in her hand. She thought about the canvas jacket and the damp knees and the matter-of-fact way he had accepted her water bottle. She thought about the way he had said she was the one who planted it there, as if the rose garden and its history were something he kept careful account of. "Do you know who he is?" she said. "Not yet," Pauline said, "but in about 10 minutes I'm going to find out." The east wing filled steadily from 7:30. Miriam stood near the service corridor entrance and watched the guests move through the foyer, past the centerpiece arrangement she had built that morning. Several of them paused at it. A woman in a dark green dress touched the edge of the complicata stem that curved outward from the lower rim and said something to her companion that Miriam couldn't hear. The woman in the camel coat, who had been part of Gerald's earlier tour, stopped in front of it for nearly a full minute. Gerald was in the foyer doing what he did at events, moving from one conversation to another with the steady efficiency of a man who understood that his value was visible rather than material. He had changed into a dark suit and looked, as he always did at these occasions, entirely at home in the role he had appointed himself to. Owen was there too, in the corner near the event brief display board, talking to 2 younger men who worked for the Land Trust. The display board had his name on it, under the heading Floral Concept and Design. Miriam had seen it when she carried the last arrangement in. She was thinking about whether to stay for the reception or go back to the workroom when she heard the foyer go slightly quieter. Not silent, just quieter, the way a room with 40 people in it becomes aware of something without quite agreeing on what to do about it. She turned. The old man was standing at the entrance to the east wing, and he was not wearing the canvas jacket. He was wearing a very good charcoal suit with a white shirt open at the collar, and beside him stood a woman of about 50 in pale grey, who carried a leather portfolio and was clearly not his companion in any social sense but his professional associate. He looked exactly like himself, the same face, the same grey-green eyes, the same quality of unhurried attention. He simply looked like himself in different clothes. A man from the estate's main office, a senior administrator named Colby, who had been with the estate for 15 years, crossed the room to him with a speed that was entirely without affectation, and the two men shook hands, and Colby said, clearly enough to carry across the quieted room, "Mr. Dixon, we weren't certain you'd be back from Edinburgh in time." The name moved through the room the way names do when they are the names of people who own things. Miriam saw it happen, saw the small realignments of posture, the turned heads, the woman in the camel coat straightening from her conversation with another board member. Christopher Dixon. The name meant the estate. It meant the endowment, the land trust funding, the renovation of the East Wing 3 years ago, the rose beds and the walled garden and the stone paths, and the gate she had come through since she was 9 years old. The name meant all of it. He was already moving through the room, shaking hands with 2 men from the Land Trust Board. He stopped near the centerpiece arrangement and stood beside it for a moment in the way a person stops beside something they recognize. His hand came up and touched the stem of the complicata at the lower rim, briefly, the same gesture the woman in the green dress had made. He looked up and found her across the room. There was nothing performed in the look. It was the same quality of attention she had felt from him in the rose garden that morning, the simple directness of someone who had already done the work of figuring out what mattered. He didn't nod or raise a hand. He simply looked at her, and she stood in the service corridor entrance very still and understood several things at once that she had not understood before. Gerald had reached his side. Gerald's progress across the room toward him had been swift and carried with it a particular eagerness that Gerald ordinarily reserved for people he considered worth impressing. The same lower register, smooth confidence mode Miriam recognized from the passage outside his office. "Mr. Dixon," Gerald said, "we're delighted you could make it. The evening is coming together beautifully. The florals especially. I think Owen's concept for the estate roses has come off rather well." There was a pause of a few seconds. Christopher looked at the arrangement and then at Gerald. "The arrangement is Miriam's," he said. "The foyer piece and the tables. She was in the rose garden at 6 this morning selecting for it." He looked at Gerald directly. "The complicata in the corner of the east beds, she used it. I wasn't sure anyone still knew what to do with that one." The pause that followed was brief, but had a particular density. The woman in the camel coat had drifted into audible range. Colby was standing to Christopher's left. The woman with the portfolio had taken a small step back, the trained distance of someone who understood when a room required space. Gerald made a recovery attempt. Of course, Miriam is the primary hands-on resource. Owen's contribution was the conceptual framework. "The concept," Christopher said, his voice carrying the mild, unemphasized weight of someone who has no reason to raise it, "is the estate's own roses in the estate's own arrangements on the estate's own grounds, which has been the practice here for 20 years. He glanced at the display board in the corner. "Who put Owen's name on the event brief?" Colby turned to look at the board. He looked back at Christopher and said nothing. His silence was its own answer. Gerald's face did a careful thing. It reorganized itself, and then found that there was nowhere entirely satisfactory for it to land. There may have been some confusion in how the credits were allocated, Gerald said. I can speak to that. I'd like you to speak to it with Colby tomorrow, Christopher said. Tonight, I'd like to speak to Miriam. He crossed the room toward her with the same unhurried pace he had used in the rose garden, and the room parted for him the way rooms do, not dramatically, just through the natural adjustment of people who understand, without being told that something is happening that they are peripheral to. Miriam had not moved from the service corridor entrance. She was aware of Pauline somewhere behind her to the left, aware of the room's attention, aware of the display board with Owen's name on it, still standing in the corner of her sight. She was aware of all of these things, and beneath them, deeper than any of them, she was aware of the complicata stem in the arrangement on the foyer table. The bare winter canes her mother had planted, and whose name her mother had known. He stopped in front of her. The arrangement is exactly right, he said. The Tuscany Superb in the upper section. That's your decision? Yes, she said. Your mother used to put that one in the upper section. She said the colour held better at distance. Miriam looked at him. You came to the garden this morning specifically, she said. You didn't wander in. He didn't deny it. I come back to that garden when I'm deciding something, he said. The roses my mother's gardener planted are still there. They deserve someone who knows their names. Your mother's gardener, she said. Edna Voss worked for my mother for 22 years, he said. She's the reason those beds look the way they do. She chose every cultivar. She planned the placement. The complicata in the corner was her idea. She said a garden needed at least one plant that looked modest and performed beautifully. He looked at Miriam with the same quality of careful attention he had given the rose canes that morning. I think she applied that principle to more than horticulture. Miriam was quiet for a moment. Around them the room continued its evening, conversations resuming, glasses lifted, the soft accumulation of voices that attends these occasions. But here in the entrance to the service corridor, there was a stillness that the room's noise did not disturb. Gerald told a vendor I'm a liability, she said. She said it without bitterness, simply as the true thing she was carrying. Kept on out of sentiment for my dead mother. Christopher was quiet for a moment. Gerald's contract with the estate is under review, he said. It has been for some months. He didn't say this as a gift or a reassurance. He said it as a matter of fact, a thing that was true and that she should know. His assessment of your work and Gerald's contract standing are not unrelated. Pauline appeared at Miriam's left elbow with 2 glasses of wine, offered one to Miriam and one to Christopher with an ease that suggested she had simply decided to be useful and brave at the same time. Christopher accepted the glass and looked at Pauline. Thank you. The arrangements are Miriam's, Pauline said. All of them. Every event this estate has hosted in 4 years. I know, he said. Pauline met Miriam's eyes for one quick second, and then moved away with the tact of someone who understood the exact moment to stop being present. The gala continued around them. Gerald moved through the remainder of the evening performing the same role he had always performed, but something in the room had shifted that his performance could not address. The woman in the camel coat no longer sought him out. Colby spoke to him once, briefly, near the drinks table, and the exchange was short in a way that Gerald's exchanges with Colby were not usually short. Owen stood near his display board for the first portion of the evening, and then, somewhere around 9 o'clock, the display board was quietly turned to face the wall by one of the event staff, and Owen found a reason to be near the coat check instead. None of this required Miriam's involvement. That was the thing about it. The room did not need her to act or speak or perform any version of herself for the correction to take place. The room simply adjusted to the reality that had arrived in it, the way a compass adjusts to north. She had been where she had always been, doing what she had always done. And the world had finally sent someone who could read what she was. At 10:30, after the last guests had filed into the main reception for the Land Trust presentation, Miriam went back out through the east wing door and down the stone path to the walled garden. The gate was unlocked. It was always unlocked. She had a key, but she had never needed it. The garden was cold and still and entirely dark, except for the low, ambient light from the estate's courtyard lamps, which came over the yew hedge and laid a faint, warm glow across the stone paths. She walked to the far end of the rose beds, to the corner post where the complicata grew, and crouched down beside it the way she had earlier in the afternoon. The canes were bare and dark against the pale stone wall. In the growing season, they would arch outward in their loose, generous way, and the blooms would be single-petaled, pink and simple, the kind of flower that looked like an afterthought until you stopped and really looked at it and saw how perfectly proportioned it was, how it had exactly as much of itself as it needed. She heard the gate and did not turn immediately. She heard the sound of footsteps on the stone path, not rushed, not hesitant. Christopher stopped a few feet from her and stood looking at the same corner of the bed she was looking at. She would have liked tonight, Miriam said. She would have liked seeing the complicata on the foyer table, he said. She spent 10 years trying to get people to use it. Miriam looked at the canes. 12 years since her mother had died. And 22 years before that, her mother had come through this gate with her hands, and her knowledge, and her instinct for what a plant wanted before the plant knew itself, and had made this garden what it was. The roses were still here. Every cultivar, every placement, every considered choice her mother had made in soil and season. Still here and still growing, long past the hands that had put them in the ground. She never told me she'd built this, Miriam said. Not in those terms. I knew she worked here. I knew she loved it. I didn't know she'd made all of it. Some people don't announce what they've built, Christopher said. They just keep tending it. Miriam stood up. She was cold, but the cold felt clean. The way winter cold in a garden is clean, stripping back the surface of things to show what is actually there underneath. What happens to Gerald's position? She said. The review will conclude after the new year. I'll ask Colby to speak with you about the florals operation before then. It needs its own structure, not a subsection of events. She looked at him. You decided that this morning, she said, in the garden. He said nothing, which was its own form of confirmation. She thought about that morning, the frost on the grass, the empty buckets, the old man kneeling by the south wall who had known the name of every rose. She thought about the water bottle she had offered without hesitation, not because she'd suspected anything, not because she'd been performing generosity for anyone's benefit, but simply because a person was there, and it was cold, and she had water. She thought about her mother, who had tended this garden for 22 years, with the same quality of unperforming attention, who had planted the complicata in the corner because the garden needed at least one thing that looked modest and performed beautifully, and who had never told anyone it was hers because it had never been about hers. She used to bring me through that gate, Miriam said. Every time we came through, I watched her face change. I thought it was just love for the work. I didn't know she was coming home. The low light from the courtyard lamps lay quiet across the stone paths. The yew hedge her mother had grown from cuttings stood solid and dark at the garden's edge. The complicata was a soft arc against the pale wall, bare-caned and patient and entirely itself, waiting for the season to turn. Christopher was still beside her, not speaking, not filling the silence with anything it didn't need. Miriam put her hand on the cane nearest to her, just lightly the way she had done that afternoon. The bark was cold and dry and faintly rough under her fingers. She held it for a moment, and then she let it go and straightened and looked at the garden her mother had made. She had been coming through that gate since she was 9 years old. She had been coming home all along,